Reeve from Reeve Consulting here today to join us to talk about this topic. Before we get going, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. Supply Chain Manitoba offices are located on the traditional territories of Treaty 1 and Treaty 2 territories and the shared lands of the Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, Dene, Anishinaabe, and Ojibwe peoples and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Reeve Consulting offices are located in Vancouver on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people. Today we have Tim Reeve to speak to you today. Tim's a pretty impressive individual. He's president of Reeve Consulting. He's a sustainable procurement advisor. He's the founder of the Canadian Coalition for Sustainable Procurement. He has over 25 years of experience. Tim, during that time, has earned a reputation as a leading sustainability practitioner and industry spokesman in the areas of sustainability, social purpose procurement, as well as ethical sourcing and worldwide ethical sourcing within the worldwide Olympic movement. Tim is president of Reeve Consulting, where his firm develops, implements, and manages sustainable supply chain strategies and sustainability programs for clients such as BC Ferries, Los Angeles Metro, the City of Vancouver, Special Olympics, the Government of Canada, and the United Nations. In speaking last time, we found out there's some other important things. He's also a father whose daughter, I believe, is in Montreal, and he's doing a lot of open water swimming where he's been swimming but swallowing a lot of salt water apparently, and he can certainly touch base on that. But he's a great guy, and we're very much looking forward to hearing his presentation today. Tim, I pass it off to you. Oh, sorry, before you get going, Tim, just everybody, if you could, just for purpose, if you could throw your Q&A, if you have questions as you're going along. Tim's happy to answer them as we're going along, but just to make sure we don't have chaos, please put your questions in the Q&A section. I will be monitoring, and then as we're going along, I will interject and pass your questions along to Tim to respond to. So sorry about that, Tim. Go ahead. It's off to you.
No problem at all, Rick. Thank you very much. And good morning, everybody. I'm Tim Reeve, president of Reeve Consulting, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here with Supply Chain Manitoba and the rest of you. Rick, thanks for the gracious introduction. I could simplify all that and say just I'm a guy that helps companies go green. And as Rick alluded to, I've been doing it for quite a long time. I was delighted when Patty and Rick and the team at Supply Chain Manitoba reached out and inquired if I'd like to be part of this webinar today. I love talking about how companies can go green and be more sustainable, and how purchasing and supply chain really feeds into that. And so we want to keep this fairly informal, I believe. I've got lots of stories to tell and some key things that I'd like to share with you. But I'd also really encourage you to, share your comments, ask questions. I can take questions and comments on the fly as we move through today. So we've got about 55 minutes together, and I really want to make sure that the things that are of most interest to you get covered off. So just in terms of a little introduction about myself and the firm that I work with, I'm Tim. Rick mentioned the Canadian Collaboration for Sustainable Procurement. That's a network of cities and universities and crown corporations across Canada that me and my team facilitate to help with this knowledge exchange. We really do a lot of work trying to help organizations become more knowledgeable about things they can do to be more green, more socially responsible, more purpose-driven and resilient, and that kind of thing. I think, next slide, Rick mentioned that I live in Vancouver, BC. I grew up here. One of the things I love to do is open water swim. I'm taking some lessons right now. I often get the sense that, if I could go swimming in the ocean near a very large city's downtown core, then that must be a pretty good indication of the health of the ecosystem around there. And most of the time I can swim in the water here in Vancouver, although not always. And we have had a couple of spills in English Bay that closed off swimming, and there's been smoke from forest fires. And that speaks to, some of the sustainability issues. But right now, weather is nice. The water temperature is warming up, and I'm taking some lessons, as Rick mentioned, to try and drink less water as I swim and go in a straighter line. Moving along, I think, I grew up in Vancouver. I've lived here most of my life. I did, when I was about 18, get the opportunity to live in southern Manitoba in the small town of Carman for a fall and winter season. It was a bit of a wake-up call for a kid from the West Coast, how cold it could get as September turned into October and October then into November. And I remember writing home to my parents at the time, remarking on how I really felt like I was getting a real Canadian experience with the southern Manitoba winter and wind chills. And we've done lots of work in Manitoba over the years. And of course, travel has been a little restricted. We can move along. But I look forward to getting back there, in the near future, I hope. This is illustrative of some of the organizations that we work with. We do a lot of work with larger organizations. As Rick mentioned, one of the specialties of Reeve Consulting is really looking at what organizations buy, their purchasing, and looking for ways to affect the purchase of products to ideally find products and services that are greener, more local, maybe are provided by Indigenous and First Nations suppliers, or have some other feature or benefit, that really contribute to overall better value. Of course, we're not buying these at any cost, but more and more organizations are seeing actual business benefits from adopting greener or leaner, or as we're going to speak about today, more circular practices. We do some work with smaller organizations, but primarily we're working with larger organizations right now. This is a little bit about the agenda. I won't go, we'll kind of move through things somewhat organically. I've got some stories to tell as we go along the way, some great stories coming right out of Manitoba that some of you maybe are familiar with or even have been involved in. Some of them may be new. And we'll talk a little bit about, supply chains and circularity and how critically related they are, and a little bit of the history around that. Maybe also a little bit about, the post-pandemic era and why this interest in circularity and sustainable procurement or sustainable supply chains or green purchasing, different kinds of similar terms, is really getting so much pickup. Social procurement would be another term you probably hear from time to time. And this is impacting business strategies and operations. We'll talk a little bit about that. And as I say, we've got some examples, both in small and medium-sized enterprises and some other interesting examples from across the country. So in terms of a little background, people speak about the circular economy. When I think about the circular economy, I think about something that I want to create or some future state that we're trying to create, an economy that is more circular. And I guess if to try and understand what that might mean, we might look at, what it doesn't mean or what we're trying to move away from. And I think historically, this work around circularity could be perhaps rooted in some of the early work around recycling and waste reduction and waste minimization. And many people perhaps will be familiar with this sort of hierarchy. It used to be called the 3 Rs. When I was growing up: reduce, reuse, recycle, recover. That maybe be some energy recovery or burning some of the worst hard to recycle materials and getting some energy recover if you could do that. And as a last resort, kind of disposing of things. And, there was a video, the story of stuff that came out, about the sort of linear economy. We dig stuff out, we make it or use it, and then we're chucking it away. And we need to try and, do more of this reusing and recycling, because we're seeing our landfills fill up, et cetera. This has really evolved, over the last 20 years to something that is really considering much more than just, can we recycle or take something apart and repair it? And so let's talk a little bit about, where things are evolving to. I've got a short video here. I'm going to say a word or two before I play it. I won't play the whole thing. We'll just play a subsection of it. But we're really evolving away from, this take, make, waste kind of society into something that is much more circular, because we're really seeing the need for all kinds of environmental, but even some social reasons as well creep into this. And so I'm going to play the video here. My colleague Katie's going to help me do that. And then I'll join you again here in about 60 to 90 seconds. And we'll let this video tell the story and come back and have a little chat. Okay.
Living systems have been around for a few billion years and will be around for many more. In the living world, there's no landfill. Instead, materials flow. One species' waste is another's food, energy is provided by the sun, Things grow, then die, and nutrients return to the soil safely. And it works. Yet as humans, we've adopted a linear approach. We take, we make, and we dispose. A new phone comes out, so we ditch the old one. Our washing machine packs up, so we buy another. Each time we do this, we're eating into a finite supply of resources and often producing toxic waste. It simply can't work long term. So what can? If we accept that the living world's cyclical model works, can we change our way of thinking so that we too operate a circular economy? Let's start with the biological cycle.
Great. So there's another couple of minutes of that, and it's well worth it. And we'll make sure you've got access to these slides and video links. And if you want to learn a little bit more about that, it tells a story in a simple way that I think is really easy to understand. And we'll see more about what those closed circles could look like as we move along. But as I say, this work was historically rooted in our efforts to try and, especially address issues around waste. And, the commentary in the video speaks to that this really can't work on the long term. And I think we're really starting to bump up to some degree against that long term as we see some really significant environmental and other kinds of sustainability impacts on our planet. And I won't go through all of them because we're living through them now. And, you folks in Manitoba have experienced extreme weather events. And, while flooding has been somewhat historical, the intensity of it is changing, it feels like. And we too here in British Columbia have seen things and, around waste. But the accumulation of plastics in the oceans, barges of garbage going back and across the ocean because, we're trying to export things that really have no hope of being recycled because we've done a poor job. So these are really things that we need to address. And this isn't about doom and gloom. We want to speak really about how do we create a more sustainable future. And that's where the circularity principles, really start to come in. There's impacts, and we're interested in purchasing. It is sort of the reason for our little business. We're a team of 5 in Vancouver, and as I alluded to earlier, we work really across the country and further afield, and even sometimes on great big events. And we really believe it's what people buy, that has one of the biggest impacts on how sustainable or eco-friendly their organization is ultimately going to be. This slide just illustrates some of the impacts associated with different types of purchasing. And, we probably, all of you have probably, may well have purchased something already today. And you could think about things that you bought, whether you got a cup of coffee or whether it was a takeout or reusable container, or how we moved around mobility. If you've got office supplies or furniture or whatever kind of electronic device that you've connected into here today, these purchasing impacts, these purchases that are day to day and are part of the way we live, they all have impacts. And so that's what we really want to try and look at Reeve. And this idea of a more circular economy being enabled through thinking more about what we purchase and giving bias to those things that have less impact or better outcomes is really where we want to go. Rick mentioned, by the way, that if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat and we'll happily take those as we go. So we're really in the shift now as away from this linear economy, as the video alluded to a more circular kind of economy. And it is more than just thinking about recycling or even repairing our washing machines or iPhones or toasters, which, in recent times very rarely were repaired. In fact, one of the reasons being is because they were not well designed for repair, tough to take apart even, or proprietary information that doesn't allow folks to get access to, how to repair things. And so we have to change the way we design and some of our design thinking so that things are more easily repaired and reused, and that we're designing waste out. And that kind of is that second box moving around the system thinking, imagining as we're creating, products or building projects or providing services to our customers or citizens, that we're doing it in a way that really starts to think about these impacts and keeping things in the system as much as possible. That's that last one on the bottom, product life extension. How do we keep things in the system as absolutely as long as possible? And again, we're going to see, there's a great story some of you may be familiar with around clothing and scraps that really speaks to that. Of course, my career in green and sustainability got started in the recycling sector. I worked for about 10 years in the recycling sector in British Columbia, and it is, I believe, an integral part of a more sustainable future. It's not the first thing we want to be doing, but definitely, there is a point when materials can't effectively be used within a circular design and manufacturing system, and they need to be reconstituted. And that's where the recycling come in. But we want to try and keep things in that sort of system as much as possible is where we're going. So how does that kind of happen? Well, let's, take a look. First, this emphasis on eliminating waste and pollution is really critical. And as I say, it's all, in some ways historically kind of at the root of things. But it's that designing out of the waste and the pollution, keeping products and materials in use, and to some extent, even, an ability to regenerate natural systems. That sounds pretty wild. But I was just listening to some interesting podcasts recently on the concept of sponge cities, which isn't so much a product, of course, but it is a design movement to build urban areas in a way that has more permeable surfaces, roofs, sidewalks, roadways, parks, to collect water and store it temporarily before it moves through, as a way to minimize the impacts of floods. And in doing so, and there's a number of pilot projects taking place in China right now, they're looking at actually daylighting creeks that used to be covered up by the urban space, and putting back wetlands and greenlands into parks and other along roadways and things. This regeneration of natural systems is a way to manage or mitigate, some of the impacts of changing climates or other kinds of eco impacts. So this is a shift in thinking. We're seeing lots of things going on. It's really exciting, actually, to see all the innovation that's going on in this space right now. It's why I feel, quite hopeful about where things can go, notwithstanding the fact that there are really some serious issues that we're facing right now. And so, further on in terms of bringing the supply chain element of in a little bit further, now we're starting to talk about circular supplies and services, or products as a service. And so an easy example might be carpet tiles, which we've historically put into our office facilities, hotels, conference centers, all kinds, academic institutions, airports, all kinds of places have carpeting and flooring, of course. Historically, these big rolls out there, and then it wears out in the doorway. And so you have to replace the whole carpet because the doorway is worn out as people go in and out of the conference room or whatever the case. Now these carpet tiles allow people to selectively remove the ones that are worn out or stained or whatever. They're made from recycled materials, and ideally, they're relatively easy to recycle. And in fact, nobody really wants to own carpeting at the end of the day. What you really want is the service or feature or benefit that comes from soft flooring that reduces acoustics and spaces and these sorts of things. So it's starting to reimagine, how products that historically, maybe could be services. And then, of course, extending that as long as possible, that middle part of it. And, thankfully, we're seeing some good work taking place around product refurbishment, product repair, more work around ensuring things are durable, and thankfully complemented by some legislative initiatives. You may have heard about some initiatives called the Right to Repair. I think there's about 36 states in the United States now that have adopted these right to repair legislation, which means that manufacturers of toasters and microwaves and blenders and iPhones, have to give their consumers the opportunity to be able to take those products and get them repaired, and not necessarily from the original manufacturer, but if they want to go to a local shop or a repair center or something like that, or even do it themselves, that they actually have the ability. There's the instructions and the availability of the parts to make that happen. That hasn't been the case. And that kind of leads into the sharing platform. We're seeing all kinds of things going on there. Of course, there was these car sharing initiatives that are starting up in across cities across North America and further afield, of course. We see sharing centers, where people are sharing lawnmowers and power tools or sporting equipment and things like that. And they sort of check it out, for use on a short-term basis, as opposed to us all owning that stuff and using it only so once in a while. And it sits up taking space somewhere in our carports or basements or whatever the case may be. So, really starting to reimagine, and this all sort of, is without overstating the obvious, really relates to what we buy, or how we fully utilize the things that we buy, and extending the value of what we buy. And only at the very end of the process or the system, do we take things for recycling or for energy recovery, or in the very, very last case, some kind of safe, proper disposal somewhere. So what does this look like? Well, all kinds of examples. A great local one is Mother Earth Recycling in Winnipeg, which has for some time been a service provider to the city of Winnipeg, providing valuable services on a fee-for-fee basis. And in this case, they've been doing electronics product recycling as well as mattresses. And what's, of course, they're providing a good service. It's got some recycling and upcycling going on, but also there's really a unique features about the organization itself, and that it's an Indigenous run organization. It's a social enterprise, so they want to be financially viable, but their primary reason is to do good things in the community, employment and training and things of that nature. And so, here's an opportunity where, materials are being collected, they're staying out of the waste stream for longer periods of time. Some of them are getting reused and recycled, and some of things are getting recycled. But we're starting to move up that waste hierarchy. And not only is it doing some good environmental things, but there's also some great social features to the organization itself. So we're getting kind of a cool service from an interesting organization in terms of how it's structured or its ownership, et cetera. Now, the pandemic has had, that's just one example, and we'll talk about some more. And there's another video I want to show you as well. The pandemic has had some big impacts, and obviously, but impacts in terms of interest in circularity. And what I mean by that is that I think that we can move along. The pandemic has really highlighted some fragility within our supply chains. And, whether it's the availability of things, or early on our ability, to be self-sufficient or not, and things like, protective equipment and the gloves and the masks and testing kits and all sorts of things that were required early on that we suddenly found we couldn't get access to in a timely way. The terrible impacts on our local businesses. And so we started to really, and the need to support, local enterprises or Manitoba enterprises, or, from a Canadian perspective, Canadian organizations, and ensure that folks weren't getting left out in kind of a recovery. And so, we have seen within our work, of course, ongoing interest in the green side of things and how to reduce environmental impacts, but also when it comes to supply chains, how can we diversify our suppliers and have more suppliers that are small and medium-sized enterprises getting pieces of our contracts, who themselves have ownership from different minority communities or historically disadvantaged groups. And so, big organizations have been really thinking differently, I think, as a result of the pandemic, about who they source things from, both on an international and domestic basis, but also the makeup of those suppliers as well. And that's had a really big moving along to, interest in local. And of course, historically, there has been interest in local purchasing, and there's some great data from some local purchasing research think tanks about the multiplier effect that comes, $1 of spending locally is sort of $4 of local economic activity as we spend our dollars locally, and the impacts on the community. Again, institutions, I think, in this COVID recovery have been thinking about this buy back better, and buy back better is a lot of the time thinking about local purchasing as well, and supporting local suppliers and ensuring that our local businesses are able to somehow survive and get back to a place where they can really flourish. They are, of course, the engine of our economy in Manitoba and in Canada, British Columbia, where I am here, and in all across Canada. And so it's critical. And again, we've been seeing larger organizations, cities, universities, crown corporations, being more deliberate in their efforts, I think, to source locally. And again, because of the multiplier effect of local purchasing, that creates more sort of resilient local economies. And that's also part of a more circular economy, is where the money and the value is recirculating. We can't live independent of importing and exporting, but certainly there's a lot more we can do, both nationally and provincially, to support local businesses. And then I think there's also been just a real increase in interest in, the transparency within supply chains, and where do products come from, and how are they made, and what are the labor conditions, and what are the impacts related to shipping these things, and why are we seeing crunches and delays? And so, again, going back to some of the early days of the pandemic, I recall, some of the concerns about where we were sourcing our PPE and the protective equipment, and the manufacturing of some of those supplies coming from some pretty potentially suspect factories over in Southeast Asia. And did that really align with our values? We saw this federal government, in fact, come out with some bold declarations around where they would be sourcing some of their protective equipment because of concerns about labor abuses in the supply chain. And I think, again, under this COVID recovery that we're in, there has been a great deal more interest in where products come from, and what are the working conditions associated with them, and what are some of the supply chain impacts. So all of that has really resulted in sort of a greater level of interest, and a bit of a spotlight on procurement and supply chains, and impacts, both negative but opportunities and innovation opportunities on a positive basis. And so that's really, that's really great. And obviously, timely, we can see Supply Chain Manitoba really positioning itself around some of these issues, because these are things that I believe are going to be really relevant to you folks. So we are seeing this now, notwithstanding the pandemic and the spotlight that I mentioned, starting to show this on business strategies and operations. And that's really starting to result in folks, thinking about how they might approach their business differently, to perhaps be more aligned with the circular economy, or principles around recycling and reusing, or eliminating waste, or creating more circularity. Pardon me. Of course, one of the things that occurs is that right away, there are some myths perhaps that come up around, going down that route. And is sustainability or green, can that be a viable business strategy? And I think, of course, I'm a bit biased that, the answer is a resounding yes. Of course, it needs to be done thoughtfully and efficiently, but we know that people will be fearful that going down this route is going to cost them more money. But in fact, when circularity and sustainable business operations are done well and done efficiently, then they really should result in cost savings. Most folks spend money to have their dumpster tipped and their garbage taken away. Some folks even spend money to have their recycling taken away. So the more we can do to reduce, the waste or the stuff that ends up for low value recycling, the more that's going to come back as a business benefit, either to ourselves directly or through our landlords if we're leasing space. And hopefully they're going to pass it along. Ditto on energy, ditto on a number of other factors where you can reduce those inputs, the cost of your inputs, by being more green and lean, then that should really result in some savings. Might take a little bit of time to get there. There needs to be a good business case, but we typically, and increasingly, especially with new regulations and other kind of cost factors on small businesses, going down this route, it's sort of like investing in people. It costs a lot of money when people leave, and you have to hire new people. So you make some investments in getting the right folks and hopefully keeping them happy. And it's similar with this. sometimes we hear people say, well, this is just another word for recycling and waste reduction. But in fact, it's much more than that. And as you know, I alluded to earlier, it's really about rethinking to some degree, you know, the systems that are resulting in our products and services, or how we are delivering those services, or how we make them so they're easier to repair, or how something that we sell as a product, maybe we could provide as a service. And so it really is much more than just ensuring that, you know, laptops and pop cans, you know, get into a bin or a box somewhere for recycling. This is really about a more innovative way, potentially, of thinking about how we run our businesses. And of course, it can feel a bit daunting to get started. You know, and so, you know, hopefully webinars like this one give some insight to folks around, you know, some of the possibilities. You know, there'll be some, you know, resources that are created, you know, guides, and tools and things. There's lots of them for businesses that want to go green. And we, of course, at Reeve Consulting believe very strongly, you know, that keeping things simple, and it's better to just make 1 or 2 or 3 changes and make sure they work really well, rather than trying to do a whole lot of things for your organization. And especially if you're a small to medium-sized enterprise, then you only have so much bandwidth to do kind of business improvements and things like that. So, you know, we
So,
really,
Tim,
yeah,
just interject. So I guess if you just going back to maybe touch on that first myth a little bit, because I think that that's a critical one, because I think it's a matter of perspective. I think people look at the physical cost of an item, whatever it may be, and they say, hey, look, the one I'm buying is $5, and the one you're trying to tell me that's better for the environment is $10. And they're just seeing the $5 expense, you know, added to their expenses. But maybe just speak to more, because this is really about, you know, organizations and the need to merely, like you said, think more systems thinking, making it visual, and understanding the total cost of that item throughout their supply chain, from point of origin to point of consumption, and of course, beyond, if you're going to make it circular. Like, I think it's understanding the total cost of what you're doing, as opposed to just that immediate, what I see in front of me, this costs $5 more. Can you maybe speak to the need to organizations to kind of change their paradigm or their viewpoint of how they look at costs?
sure thing. Yeah. Well, you said it yourself there, Rick. I think it's that concept of total cost of ownership, and that total cost of ownership is really kind of a critical component of green working well when it comes to supply chains and purchasing, because it is true, sometimes the green product, you know, is going to cost a little bit more. An energy efficient light bulb, a more fuel efficient vehicle, perhaps. You know, those might be 2 easy examples, but what we know in both those cases is that if you look at costs over time, and the savings on energy that comes from more of energy efficient lighting, then it really does have quite a compelling financial case. And similarly on the alternative fuel vehicles, or more fuel efficient vehicles, or even, you know, potentially e-vehicles in the future, you know, that while they have a higher upfront costs, you know, their operating and maintenance costs over the longer term are going to be considerably lower than benchmark. Of course, you know, we need to enable organizations to be able to absorb that upfront cost to get the payback over time. And again, that sort of speaks, as you alluded to some of that rethinking. You know, we're starting to see budgeting occur in a slightly different way within large organizations, so that, you know, they're moving more to this total cost basis, so that an internal department isn't penalized for spending a little bit more now, knowing that that's going to save the organization quite a bit over the longer term. You know, these things need a business case. It doesn't cost out in every instance, but increasingly, I think, you know, that we are seeing that as organizations think about the costs of both acquiring a product or a service, using it, and then potentially disposing of it or getting rid of it, and when they look at those costs in a more holistic way, you know, then suddenly there's a different cost model that occurs, or a different outcome that occurs, than just focusing in on sort of, you know, unit price, and especially cheapest unit price. So this idea of total cost of ownership, which is a long-term historical kind of principle, within procurement, it works easier for some items than others, really is an underpinning to sort of better green purchasing or more circular kinds of economies enabled through sustainable supply chains. So thanks for mentioning that. And if others have comments or questions, please pop them in the chat, and we'll address them as we move along. I've got a couple of more stories and slides to speak of, and then we'll have time for some general discussion or questions if people have them. We really believe at the end of the day that most organizations are going on some kind of journey to be greener or more sustainable, and whether formal or informal, they've got ideas about, we want to reduce our waste, or we want to save water, or we want to eliminate toxics, or we want to support local businesses, or we want to advance a diversity and inclusion agenda. And those are all good things to do ultimately. What we really want to emphasize is that you can do those things more effectively through your procurement. And if you look at what you buy, it's really hard to get to zero waste or carbon neutral or to do local economic development if you're not looking at what you're buying. And so we really see sustainable procurement or sustainable supply chain or green purchasing, whatever you want to call it, as an engine of an organization's ability to go green, be it a large organization or even a small organization. If you're trying to go green as a small to medium-sized enterprise, probably one of the first things you're going to do is start looking at what you're buying and potentially making some different decisions around that. When we think about sustainable procurement at Reeve, we believe that all products and services have sort of slightly different combination of risks or opportunities. The things you might think about when you're buying furniture for your office might be different than when you're buying maybe a vehicle for your company or yourself. And that could be different again from maybe any uniforming or promo products that you wanted to give to your customers. And so we really believe that sustainable, kind of defined as 4 pillars: environmental issues, indigenous issues, social, local, diversity issues, and of course, human rights, like no child labor, that these things can be a blend of things one might consider when they're purchasing. And some show up more when you're buying uniforms, like the human rights and no child labor. And others, maybe mattress recycling, could be more within the indigenous or the social pillar. And so depending on the product or service you're going to buy, different issues might show up. And the goal is to try and mitigate negative issues and find opportunities, positive opportunities in some of these pillars. But just for communication purposes, when we speak about sustainable supply chains or sustainable procurement, we often think of these sort of 4 pillars that, as I say, change depending on what we're buying. And when we think about, a sustainable procurement program or a sustainable supply chain as a way to enable a more circular economy, for larger organizations, we would imagine that they might have some of these kinds of elements within their effort or within their overall program, maybe a policy around their purchasing and buying more sustainable products from sustainable suppliers, maybe some training for their staff on how to do that, or some tools, maybe a HIPPO list or a shopping list. We call that a high impact procurement opportunities, HIPPO list. What are 5 categories that I buy in that probably have big green or indigenous or social risks or opportunities? And, can I get started right there? So this is tailored to a little bit more to larger organizations, a city of Winnipeg, a Crown Corporation within Manitoba, or private sector company. But these elements, also apply to smaller organizations as well, but just in kind of a lighter format. And when this work is done well, when one can be efficient and thoughtful and focused on, in particular within our topic today of sustainable supply chains, for a more circular economy, really focusing on a few product and services that we're buying that have big impact or big opportunity, and starting to shift our thinking around how we measure costs or how we work with our suppliers to try and recover things, then this just brings lots of business benefits. Your brand goes up as people see you doing cool things, your eco impact goes down. Hopefully you're saving some money, especially over the medium term, by being more knowledgeable about where products come from, how they're made, regulations that might impact that. You are likely reducing risks. People that work for your company feel better because they see the company doing the right thing around what they buy and where it comes from. So then they're more ready to do the next kind of green call to action, et cetera. And I mentioned doing innovative things with suppliers. So we just see so much benefit from this. Of course, it takes some work. And as Rick said, there needs to be a good business case based on some total cost of ownership. But as a long-term business strategy, this is absolutely where things are going to go. And companies that can do small things, but be very systematic. So over a year or 2 or 3 year process, really make some good changes, then they're going to see lots of kinds of benefits like this. Another story, this one out of the Atlantic region, city of Halifax, looking again for, a typical product that they buy, picnic tables for parks and recreational departments around the region. But, could they get a good product for a good price that was good quality and hopefully durable with some other kinds of sustainability features or benefits? And so through a competitive bid process, a contract was signed with Lake City Works. And again, like Mother Earth Recycling, a local social enterprise. So another great example of small, medium-sized enterprise being competitive in the delivery of a good service or a good product. And they make these picnic tables that are made out of recovered material, recycled material, especially difficult to recycle stuff like plastic bags, which historically have been really difficult, or we've had to export them and not a lot of success with the recycling there. So, they're taking some difficult to recycle materials that are really reaching the end of their useful life within a circular system, perhaps to be designed out in the future, getting that back into a useful product, selling it to a customer at a decent, fair price. And in the course of doing so, doing some good things around, employment opportunities for local folks, and training and development opportunities with people with disabilities. So another great story, and it's got a circularity element and also kind of a social element. And a lot of the time we see these things go together. It's not uncommon to see wins in a couple of the different pillars: green and social, or indigenous and environmental, etc. And again, just thinking from a purchasing perspective, how does this show up? It really shows up mostly at the front end of this, and this is kind of theoretical in terms of a procurement life cycle, but ultimately, all of us, even in our day-to-day, life, just day-to-day purchases, think to some degree, okay, what do I need? What am I going to buy? What are the features of what I'm looking for? Where am I going to get it? And if I am faced with a couple of choices on the shelf, or this store or that store, how am I going to select the one that I think meets my interests most? And perhaps we're not doing a whole lot of monitoring and performance afterwards, but in any event, sustainability shows up across all of these different elements. And it is a way that we think it can really transform the way purchasing and supply chain activities take place. And that's really going to enable this long-term shift to a more circular kind of economy. All kinds of benefits. I mentioned some of them a little bit earlier. And what I really think, this work kind of does is really drive this innovation agenda. The more we can get organizations talking to their suppliers about opportunities to reduce risks, do cool things together, that just is going to create a world of opportunity. And it's going to really also strengthen our local economies. I think I've got another video perhaps to show. Let's, well, before we show the video, I'd just like to speak a little bit about Anne Molaire. Perhaps you know of Anne Molaire's business. Really another great example. I mean, this really speaks to the heart of circularity. They are, of course, creating clothing for customers, but they've got a couple of really interesting ways that they go about it. This idea of rethinking and redesigning their business. They really are, absolutely utilizing every scrap of fabric that they are originally purchasing. And they're even upcycling scrap fabrics from other processes to turn it into their clothing. And what's neat too is that they've also got a refresh program. So when clothing starts to wear out, kind of like that carpet tile in the doorway, when the knee rips open and you don't want a knee that's ripped open, or the bum gets a hole in it, or whatever the case may be, you can bring it back. And they're actively encouraging you to bring back, the clothing, and they'll repair it. And so, as opposed to, this fast fashion, which is the other side of it, which is just use it, maybe even before it's even reached, it's worn out, we're chucking it out because it's no longer in style or whatever the case may be. So, this really is rethinking what's designed, what is sold, what is wasted. It's really all built around these principles of circularity, and they're being really successful about it. And so it's meeting some of those financial requirements as well. Here's the video. Again, perhaps you've heard of Torque Brewery. Some great things, again, looking at taking waste products and repurposing them, and how just looking at that then opens up opportunities to see other potential improvements within the business. So I'll let the video tell the story, and we'll roll away here.
Making beer is pretty fundamentally the same as it has been hundreds of years ago. We're using a malted barley or a malted cereal grain. It comprises itself of barley, wheat, we get oats, rye, you name it. So the biggest byproduct is going to be that cereal grain that we've now taken and extracted our starches and created sugars. One of the biggest problems is trying to find uses that won't clog up landfills. What we have done is in the past, we have used it as a compost media. It's really good when you're not dealing with a large volume, but as volumes start increasing, as we've seen historically with our company, is the cost goes up. What we can use it also for is actually for food. We can reintroduce it back into the food industry. The mash byproduct is actually a great supplement for livestock, going from cattle to pigs. It can be used for dog treats. And we've done in the past where it's used as a protein boost, and it's also used for bread making. We have a local baker, Loaf and Honey, that actually uses it for producing bread. They're benefiting from a waste byproduct that we would have, and it's growing their business as well. So for us, trying to get it into areas that can be reused and integrated back into our lifestyles is a big important factor for us.
So great story there. And, interesting again to hear that fellow speak about sort of moving up the hierarchy. Initially, there was some composting opportunity for that, waste byproduct, that organic material, but then, looking for higher value uses as well. And, obviously starting to think about, how that could have effects on their business. I won't take the time just now, but, again, we'll provide the links for these videos. If we were to play it a little bit more, I think we'd hear some interesting things that they're doing around water. And of course, water is a big input for beer making. And historically, beer making has discharged a lot of wastewater. And so now there's more and more, especially within the microbrew industry, effort being made to minimize the use of water and reclaim water. And just coincidentally, I happened to be at an agricultural training school just last week doing a workshop. And at such school, Kwantlen Polytechnic University in the Fraser Valley of British Columbia, they actually have a small brewery where they're teaching people to become brewers. And in fact, in their little microbrewery on campus, they're now experimenting with ways to both find uses for the mash, but also significantly reduce water use and train future brewers to be aware of these kinds of sustainability impacts so they can bring them into their businesses, as Torque has been doing as well. So maybe, we'll one last one, a larger organization out of Ontario, city of Mississauga. And again, we can see that, buying a typical product, in this case, a laptop, to help facilitate election stations at the local municipal election that was taking place a couple of years ago. They get all these laptops, and they were coming horrendously overpackaged. And they went to the supplier and said, hey, what can be done? Every single laptop is coming in a box with this plastic pillows in it. There's got to be something to do. So Lenovo was responsive and identified a way they could ship the laptops 25 at a time, significant reductions in packaging, no loss of service or quality or financial impact for the city of Mississauga, a reduction in cost, in fact, for Lenovo as they reduced the amount of material that they needed for packaging and delivering stuff to their customers, and hopefully an innovation that they could then take to other customers who were interested in this as well. Of course, City of Mississauga had less cardboard boxes and plastic pillows to deal with as well on site in terms of clogging up their own garbage or even adding extra stuff to their recycling, because in some cases cardboard is so low value that you're paying to have that recycled and taken away. So even getting something in a cardboard box isn't necessarily more eco-friendly. So these are just some of the stories. Final one here. I know we need to wrap up here in just a second. Happy to take any questions or hear a comment from people. Again, Thompson River University, university in the central part of British Columbia, a couple of different campuses, main one based in Kamloops. And of course, like a lot of large institutions, surplus furniture and what to do with it. And of course, buying new furniture all the time. But they really, through the work of their supply chain and their procurement group, stepped in and developed an online marketplace for staff to claim furniture that was sent to the TRU warehouse. And as it became more, as folks became more aware of it, and as they wanted to use their departmental budgets for other things, they found they could source furniture, good quality, in some cases refurbished furniture, from the TRU reuse program. And so, just a way to repurpose things, keep them in their useful life longer, delivering value back to the campus and to the departments. They can then use their budgets for other things. So just ways to keep things in the system longer, changing our way of thinking, moving away from this linear model to something that's much more kind of circular. So, my main kind of takeaway, my main sort of final message here is that, this move to a more circular economy is being driven by supply chain activities and, and the kinds of things that Supply Chain Manitoba is doing to heighten awareness, to bring, put a bit of a spotlight on the opportunities in this area, I think is really smart and critical because, if we look at the sort of major trends that are happening across the country and in this space, we're just seeing more and more emphasis all the time on when I'm buying something, what are really the total costs of that? What are the sort of holistic impacts? And without turning it into a giant science project, really thinking about, what are some simple things that we could start to do differently, that's going to reduce the impacts, drive innovation, and ultimately lead to something that's more circular. I know this is just a bit of an intro on the topic, and I believe there's more to come in the fall. But for today, I'm going to leave it at that. And I just want to say thanks again to Supply Chain Manitoba, to my colleague Katie Allen here in Vancouver for helping me with the prep and sourcing some of the stories, and to Rick and Patty and Aaron and Minley and the team at Supply Chain Manitoba to get a chance to work with you again. Thanks a lot, and happy to answer any questions or take any comments. Over to you, Rick.
Thank you, Tim. And we'll just wait for everybody to kind of absorb that and see if we get something in the Q&A. I do have somebody want to throw at you to kind of get started though.
Yeah.
I think from what you're saying, I think one of the takeaways, at least for me, and I'm sure everybody else is, there isn't a home run on this. Like, it's important to, on the things you talked about, it's about incremental. It's about just start to make decisions and start to make those incremental changes that move you from linear to more circular practices. So don't be, like, if you don't have that magic bullet that goes from here to there, don't be discouraged. Just keep doing the things.
Absolutely.
I think that's one of the key things, I think, is a good takeaway.
Yeah, absolutely. We often talk about this kind of 100-mile journey, where 100 miles sort of represents this sort of more sustainable destination, but we're not going to kind of go from mile 20 to mile 95 in one great big leap here. And we're firm believers that we will get to mile 100 by methodically plodding along, 10, 15 miles at a time. And, a lot of the organizations that we work with across Canada, arguably would self-declare that they're sort of at mile 20 or mile 30 or mile 40 on their sustainability journey. And they really want to know, like, what are 2 or 3 or 5 things that we could do to get ourselves to mile 60 and mile 70? And how can we do, just a few things in 1 year to move us forward in a thoughtful way, as opposed to kind of analyzing forever, 27 things that we could do to, that would ultimately make us perfect, but we don't get any of them done. And a year or two later, we're just in the same place.
Yeah.
So you really take that incremental approach, but with a little bit of urgency. I would say we don't have, decades to fiddle around here. That's why we want to, stay focused, do some things that'll have some impact, use that as a foundation to get better.
Progress, not perfection. It's the other, so based on that, using that analogy, I'm going to borrow on that analogy then, about every journey starts with a step. What do you think the first step should be? Like, you had some stuff about where some of the larger organizations, and you had that screen with some of the elements that are involved. You said it was kind of for larger, but for an SME particularly, like somebody that falls into that wants to move forward, but this seems daunting. What should their first step be? Like, we talk about incremental, it's great.
Yeah.
But what is that first step that gets them moving in that direction? What should they be thinking about?
Yeah, great question. I would say, well, one would be kind of the supply, a little bit of a tease, and that is that we're going to talk about more of that in the next webinar. So I encourage folks to come back after summer. But seriously and quickly now, one of the first places is look at what you're purchasing. What are some of the 3 or 4 or 5 big categories of spend within your organization? Who are some of your, your top suppliers of whatever kinds of products or services or inputs that you're using? And, think about those sort of 4 pillars, and in the things that you're purchasing from, your top kind of critical inputs, your top most trusted suppliers, et cetera, are there issues around packaging or energy efficiency or waste, or what's, are you interested in working with more local businesses or supporting businesses that are owned by minority groups? I really think, of course, without sort of stating the obvious, that a simple spend analysis of, what are your top 4 or 5, kind of cost categories, and, what are the opportunities within those 4 or 5 cost categories to look at something that might represent potentially better value. And I will just say quickly, that doesn't necessarily mean moving away from who you buy from right now. A lot of the great stuff happens by actually working with existing suppliers to brainstorm and innovate around new ways of doing things that could be beneficial for both you as the purchasing customer and for them as the supplier, because they can replicate that innovation with other potential customers and maybe use it as a way to grow their business.
Oh, that's excellent. I'm not seeing other questions, so and that's a great way we could segue. We can be like the TV shows. We can have that great cliffhanger for this season before we move into next season.
Sure.
But I'll just give everybody maybe a minute here to maybe throw any questions that they have. While they're doing that, I just want to mention a couple things. One, we want your feedback for everybody that's attended. Please complete the survey and share your thoughts on today's webinar. And because we want to get better, and we can't do that if we don't get feedback from anybody who's participated. And just as Tim alluded to, we have more sessions scheduled in the fall with Tim, and we're hoping that you will join us for those to find out other great things and suggestions that Tim has for all of us, and also to encourage other people within your networks to come and join us and learn a little bit more about this, of how moving to a more circular approach to their business is good for them, in terms of their business and profitability, but also good for the environment. It's a key thing to start looking at business maybe from more of a triple bottom line, as opposed to traditional profit and loss, where you're looking at people, planet, and I'm missing now. People,
planet, and profit.
Yeah, there you go. I've actually forgot the good one, but people, planet, and profit, where you're having a balanced approach to what you're doing. So. But not seeing any more questions. Tim,
I'll just say, I'll just say one other thing in response to your earlier query about, where would be a natural place to start. I mentioned sort of take a look at sort of a couple of your largest spend categories or cost categories and look for opportunities there. The other one would be, get connected into communities who are interested in this, because you're just going to learn a ton from them. And I would, I'm just seeing in the chat a couple of familiar names. Manitoba has a lot of folks that are doing great work in this area. And I'm delighted that you chose to invite us to speak with you today. But I see, Corrine Evison from the city of Winnipeg on the line. There's networking groups in southern Manitoba and across the province that are doing all kinds of really cool things around circularity and going green and procurement. And so tap into your local networks, because you're just going to get a lot from those connections.
Yeah, and Supply Chain Manitoba is going to help try to connect you with some of that as we go along. So Tim, once again, great presentation as usual. Thank you for sharing your time with us and coming to talk. And everyone, as I said, please fill out your surveys, provide your feedback, and please register for the fall events with Tim again as we try to get everybody moving in this direction. So thank you. Please have a great day, and we'll talk to you all again soon.
Great stuff. Thanks again, Rick.